Wizard of Oz is a timeless classic that has captivated generations with its magical land and unforgettable characters. But what if I told you there was a sequel, one so dark and traumatizing that it's pretty much been erased from existence? But the craziest part of all of this is that it's actually the most faithful adaptation of the original books. That's right, there is so much more to this story than you ever thought you knew. Welcome to the terrifying world of Return to Oz, a movie so haunting, so twisted that it will completely change everything you thought you knew about the classic tale. The sequel presents Oz as a dark and decaying world filled with grotesque creatures, terrifying villains, and an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. The bright and cheery fantasyland we knew from MGM's The Wizard of Oz is nowhere to be found. Instead, Dorothy finds herself in a crumbling emerald city where her old friends have been turned to stone, and her new enemies are far more disturbing than any wicked witch. And do you want to know what company is behind the creation of it? Disney. Yep, you heard that right. Disney. But how did this happen? How did a children's movie from Disney, a company known for its family-friendly content, become one of the most disturbing cinematic experiences of the 1980s? What could possibly be in it that children found so traumatizing? But before we break down the movie, we need to take a look at the books that started it all. And trust me, the original Oz books were more disturbing than you could have ever imagined. Published in the year 1900, L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz earned a cemented spot in the Literature Hall of Fame. Baum's early life was a series of privilege, failure, and a never-ending quest to find his true calling. After attending several schools, he struggled to find a career that he was truly passionate about. He trialed all different types of paths, from being a traveling salesman to acting in theater, but most of these ventures were unsuccessful, leaving him in debt. Despite these failures, Baum remained optimistic, always looking for the next opportunity. His creative ability to think outside the box and explore new avenues eventually led him to a career in writing. It was only shortly after that when he realized that his true calling came from the world of storytelling. He published his first book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and it became an instant success. The book was said to be revolutionary in its approach to children's literature, leading Baum to continue the story, adding 13 books to the series. He created a world that was fantastical whilst also showing elements of triumph and hardships, which really resonated with readers. The unsettling sequel, Return to Oz, uses both the second book, The Marvelous Land of Oz, and the third book, Ozma of Oz. Again, what happens in this movie will both shock and disturb you, but we will talk about that in just a second, okay? Trust me, you don't want to miss it. After the first book was published, the success was so huge that in 1902, just 2 years later, The Wizard of Oz was turned into a musical. The show was a success and ran for more than 290 performances, which was quite impressive at the time. Then, in 1910, one of the first film adaptations of The Wizard of Oz was made, which was a silent film. Over the following years, many films attempted to adapt the popular story, but sadly, none of them really ever hit the mark. The world of Oz kind of just stayed stagnant in popularity, but Baum continued to write his books all the way until his death in 1919. A few years later, Walt Disney Studios made history when they released their first animated feature, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. The film was a groundbreaking success, which proved that fantasy films could be both critically acclaimed and commercially successful. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer producer Mervyn Leroy, fresh from his success at Warner Brothers, was determined to create a film that could rival Disney's achievement. The Wizard of Oz, which had maintained steady popularity throughout the years, seemed like the perfect choice. MGM saw the potential in the material and paid Baum $75,000 for the rights to his book, a considerable amount for the time, indicating their commitment to the project. The studio was especially eager to demonstrate their mastery of Technicolor, which was still a relatively new and expensive process. The Wizard of Oz would allow them to create spectacular visual effects effects while highlighting the dramatic contrast between Kansas and Oz. I'm sure we've all heard that the making of this movie turned out to be one of the most cursed productions in film history. There was multiple near-death experiences as well as a hanging munchkin. Everyone keeps coming after me for how I say munchkin. I don't want to talk about it. I can't say it any other way. Please don't bully me. It's honestly far too much to get into, but I actually made a whole video on it, so if you want to go watch that after you watch this, that would be very much appreciated. By the grace of God, the movie actually finishes filming, but despite what a lot of people think, the movie is very different from the original book, with MGM making numerous significant changes. These ranged from minor details to major plot elements, which includes the erasure of the entire third act. And knowing how the third act ends is crucial to understanding Return to Oz, so you guys better turn your listening ears on right now. For starters, one of the most significant changes is that the film frames Oz as a dream. In Baum's book, Oz is a real place, and Dorothy's adventures there actually happen. The film's decision to make it all a dream sequence, with Kansas characters reappearing as their Oz counterparts, fundamentally alters the story's meaning and impact. This change diminishes the reality of Oz and takes a lot of the fantasy out of the story. We all know Dorothy's famous ruby slippers that she wears in the film. Well, in the book, they're not actually ruby, they're silver. This change was made specifically to take advantage of the new Technicolor process, as the filmmakers felt that ruby red would pop more dramatically on screen than silver. This seemingly simple change has become one of the most iconic alterations, with the ruby slippers becoming a symbol of the film itself. The Wicked Witch of the West plays a much smaller role in the book than in the film, and no, her name is not actually Elphaba. In the film, the Wicked Witch is the primary antagonist, but in the book, she only appears in one chapter, and the witch's green skin color was an invention of the film. What's fascinating is that the association with witches and green skin that we know today actually came from this character design of the Wicked Witch. So it's quite crazy to think of how influential this movie has actually been in so many aspects, many that we weren't even aware of. The journey in the book is much longer and complex. The group visits multiple communities within Oz, faces different challenges, and encounters more magical creatures. The film kind of streamlines this into a more direct journey to the Emerald City, which even the city itself is completely simplified. In the book, people that enter the Emerald City must wear green-tinted glasses because it's not actually emerald in color. It's an illusion created by the wizard. This subtle critique of authority and illusion was eliminated from the film, which presents the Emerald City as genuinely green and magnificent. Overall, the book is much more dark and sinister than the movie, which makes me actually wonder how it's considered a children's novel. One of the darkest parts of the book is the Tin Man's origin story. Before becoming a heartless metallic figure, he was a normal man, a woodcutter who fell in love with a munchkin girl. However, the Wicked Witch of the East, determined to keep them apart, cursed his axe so that every time he would use it, he would cut off a part of his body. Piece by piece, he lost his limbs, and each time, a tinsmith replaced them with metal. Eventually, his entire body was replaced with tin, but because he no longer had a heart, he lost the ability to love. There's also a chapter where the Wicked Witch sends a pack of wolves to attack Dorothy and her friends, and it's written in a surprising amount of graphic detail. The witch commands the wolves to tear them to pieces, but the Tin Woodsman stands guard. As each wolf lunges at them, he swings his axe and kills them one by one until the entire pack lies dead. I can definitely see why they felt like it was necessary to remove these scenes of violence from their children's adaptation, but the biggest thing that I'm sure everyone is curious about is what happened in the third act of the book, and why did they decide to just not include it? For context, here is a quick recap of how the film actually ends. After killing the Wicked Witch, Dorothy and her friends take her broom back to the Emerald City, where the wizard promised he would help get her home. However, it's revealed that the wizard is just an ordinary man using tricks to appear powerful. Despite this, he grants the Scarecrow a diploma, the Tin Man a heart-shaped token, and the Lion a medal for bravery, showing that they already possessed these qualities that they desired. The wizard offers to take Dorothy home in his hot air balloon, but as they prepare to leave, the balloon accidentally takes off without her. Luckily, Glinda the Good Witch appears in her bubble and tells Dorothy that she had the power to return home this entire time time by clicking her ruby slippers and saying, "There's no place like home." If I was Dorothy, I would be pissed that Glinda made me go through this entire journey just to tell me that I could have gone home the moment I got there. Are you kidding me? Anyway, Dorothy clicks her heels and wakes up back in Kansas, surrounded by her family, realizing her journey in Oz was all just a dream. Now, let me tell you how the real story ends, and keep in mind it's very important to know this so you can make sense of Return to Oz. After the wizard's departure, Dorothy and her friends learn that Glinda the Good Witch might be able to help her get home. But unlike in the film where she immediately appears in a bubble, reaching her requires a lengthy and dangerous journey through Oz's southern regions. And trust me, you don't want to go down there. During their journey south, they discover the dainty China country, a remarkable land which features an entire village made of porcelain, where the villagers live in constant fear of being broken. After leaving, the group encounters the vicious hammerhead creatures with extendable necks who attack by headbutting their enemies. Unable to pass through their territory, the group needs to come up with a plan. That's where the golden cap comes in. The golden cap is actually a major plot point which was removed from the film. In the book, whoever wears the cap has 3 opportunities to summon the flying monkeys who will obey any orders given to them. Dorothy uses her golden cap for the 3rd and final time to summon the flying monkeys who carry the group over this dangerous land. When they finally reach the castle, they're greeted by Glinda herself. She welcomes Dorothy kindly and reveals the secret of the silver shoes, which is that they had the power to take her home the entire time. But this revelation comes with important context that wasn't included in the film. Glinda explains that she couldn't tell Dorothy about the power of the shoes earlier because she needed Dorothy to help her friends and to learn to believe in herself.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Before Dorothy leaves, each of her friends receives their heart's desire. The Scarecrow is installed as the ruler of the Emerald City, the Tin Woodsman becomes the ruler of the Winkies, and the Cowardly Lion becomes the king of the forest. This longer 3rd act makes Dorothy's journey feel much more complete and earned, with each of its characters finding their proper place in the world before the final goodbye. The film's choice to remove this section is understandable for the purposes of runtime and simplicity, but in doing so, I think it removed a lot of the richness and world building that made the book so magical. But now that we know how the first book ends, we can finally get to unpacking this terrifying, disturbing sequel that is Return to Oz. I'm not ready for this. Released in 1985, Return to Oz stands as one of the most frightening children's films ever produced. This Wizard of Oz follow-up was marketed as a family-friendly fantasy, but ended up traumatizing a generation of viewers with its psychological horror elements and deeply unsettling tone. And again, this was made by Disney. Imagine the parents that took their kids to this film thinking it would be just a light-hearted Disney experience, and they ended up traumatizing their kids and giving them nightmares. So it turns out that apparently every production of The Wizard of Oz is just immediately cursed, because Return to Oz stands as one of Disney's most troubled productions ever. The film was the directorial debut of Walter Murch, better known as a legendary sound designer and film editor who worked on classics like Apocalypse Now and The Godfather. His involvement alone makes Return to Oz unique because it's rare for a sound editor to be given directorial control over a major studio film. The project began when Murch and producer Gary Kurtz approached Disney with the idea of making a more faithful adaptation of L. Frank Baum's Oz books, The Marvelous Land of Oz and Ozma of Oz, choosing to ignore the 1939 film's interpretation entirely. This decision would prove both creatively freeing and commercially challenging, as audiences had strong expectations based on the popular film. This production faced numerous difficulties from the start. The set and costume designs went completely over budget, and Murch's slow filming pace was pushing things behind schedule. After only a few weeks into production, Disney wasn't happy with what they saw and and ended up firing Murch from the project. This was when his friends Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas stepped in to help. All three directors persuaded Disney into rehiring Murch, with Lucas even offering to take over directing himself should Murch fall behind schedule. And it worked! Murch was back on the project and able to complete the film the way he intended. In order to create the many faces in the Land of Oz, a huge team was assembled of animators, puppeteers, and sculptors. But unfortunately, at this point, Disney had little faith in the film and decided to cut back a lot of its budget. This meant that a lot of the intended design had to be restricted and changed, which is a big reason why the characters have such an uncanny feel. Jack Pumpkinhead, for instance, was originally intended to have a fully animatronic face, capable of showing a range of expressions similar to the Gump character, but due to budget cuts, this feature was scrapped, leaving him as the still, expressionless puppet seen in the final film. But no one had it as bad as the actor playing TikTok. Although he may look like a robot, only his face was controlled via radio, the rest of his movement was up to actor Michael Sundin, who was made to spend hours at a time in an uncomfortable bent-over position. He wasn't able to see anything and had to rely on sounds to know where to go. The pressure from Disney caused the crew to be extremely stressed and made everyone miserable. The atmosphere on set was so tense you could cut it with a knife. If that wasn't bad enough, the lighting on set was so hot that the costumes the actors wore would occasionally melt. It was so humid that the 9-year-old actress Fairuza Balk, who played Dorothy, ended up fainting due to the extreme heat. Despite all these difficulties, everyone eventually managed to work together and the film was completed on schedule. I actually only discovered this film recently after about an hour of doom scrolling on Disney+. I was immediately intrigued and of course went into it thinking it was gonna be like the lighthearted musical I know and love. Boy, was I wrong. I'm 23 years old, but even I was unsettled and I can't imagine how I would feel if I watched it when I was young, but I think that's what makes it so fascinating. The film manages to deeply unsettle children by tapping into core childhood fears and anxieties. Instead of relying on obvious scares like traditional horror movies, it plays on deeper, more psychological fears that feel especially intense for young viewers. So without further ado, let's break down this terrifying movie. The year is 1899 and Dorothy Gale has returned to Kansas. It's been 6 long months since the tornado carried their farmhouse away, and a depressed and broken down Uncle Henry is trying to build a new one. The farm is in ruins, and to make matters worse, Bellina, the family chicken, has stopped laying eggs, leaving Aunt Em struggling to put food on the table. It's just a disaster from all ends. Dorothy, once full of life and energy, has suddenly become withdrawn and depressed. We soon learn that she hasn't slept a single night since the tornado. She's constantly talking about the place that she visited over the rainbow where animals talk and she killed a wicked witch. She's insisting that these stories are real. Of course, her aunt and uncle are very concerned about this sudden change of behavior, but brush it off hoping that it will just go away on its own. Classic parenting. A short time later, while doing her chores, Dorothy finds a key laying in the grass. She notices that the key has Oz engraved on it and becomes convinced that it's a message from her friends in Oz, a sign that they're in trouble. She desperately tries to convince her aunt and uncle of this, and in return, her aunt takes her to a psychiatric clinic. Before we dive into this part, I just wanted to mention that the fear of going to the doctors is actually one of the most common childhood anxieties. It's something that psychologically unsettles a lot of kids. So keep that in mind as we continue through this children's movie. They arrive at this gothic-looking hospital and meet with Dr. Hawley, who, after some discussion, comes to the conclusion that Dorothy is in dire need of his help. And I don't blame them. Dorothy starts going into detail about the disturbing book-accurate story of the Tin Woodsman cutting off all his limbs. Yeah, she wasn't doing herself any favors. So Dr. Wally decides that he has heard enough and he has just the thing to cure her of her delusions. Electroshock therapy. Yeah, I think that pretty much sets the tone for what this movie is gonna be. Aunt Em agrees to leave Dorothy overnight, and just like that, we meet the creepy nurse Wilson who leads her to her room, which looks more like a prison cell. Just as it sinks in that Dorothy is alone, a strange blonde girl girl appears behind her. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was watching The Shining. The blonde girl seems nice enough and even gives Dorothy a little pumpkin with a face carved in it because it's nearly Halloween or something. Suddenly, screaming can be faintly heard in the background from somewhere in the hospital. When Dorothy turns back around to the blonde girl, she's gone. What follows next is something straight out of a horror movie, with the director even using staple shots from the genre. As Dorothy waits in her room, a violent storm suddenly erupts. The most unsettling music starts playing, and the camera keeps cutting back from Dorothy to the closed door. We can hear the gurney's wheels squeak as it inches closer and closer. The tension finally breaks when Nurse Wilson opens the door and says this.
Would you like to go for a ride, Dorothy?
This is not a kid's movie. This is straight horror. Dorothy is then strapped to the gurney and is wheeled off to the surgical room by the most creepy looking nurses. She asks them why she can hear screaming through the walls, to which Nurse Wilson replies and says, "There's no screaming." What do you mean there's no screaming? Dr. Worley then meets them in the operating room and fires up his machine whilst Nurse Wilson slips it over Dorothy's head. Dorothy's heart is racing. My heart is racing as well. Just as she's about to endure the most agonizing pain, lightning strikes the hospital, which results in a power outage. The adults quickly run out of the room to try and get everything back up and running, and they leave Dorothy just laying there strapped to the gurney. Suddenly, she feels someone trying to help her, and she realizes that it's the blonde girl from before. She tells Dorothy that Dr. Worley has patients locked in his basement who were injured by the machine that he's about to use on her, and that she needs to escape right now. I think I would rather stay strapped to the table than to go running off in the middle of the night with some creepy blonde girl, but that's just me. They both sprint out of the hospital into the dark rain, with Nurse Wilson being in hot pursuit. With nowhere else to go, they both jump into the rushing river and try desperately to find something that will keep them afloat. The blonde girl tries to grab some floating debris, but misses and disappears under the water. She doesn't come back up, and it's assumed that she's drowned. Dorothy manages to cling to a crate as the floodwaters sweep her out to sea. If you watched this as a child, I just want to ask if you're okay. That was pure nightmare fuel, and that's only like the third most upsetting thing in this entire movie. Dorothy wakes up a short while later, and we realize that she's not in Kansas anymore. She then realizes that Bellina, her chicken from back home, is also with her, and she can now talk. That must mean she's back in Oz, because all animals talk in Oz. Apart from Toto, I guess. Bellina then starts to hop out of the crate, but Dorothy stops her. She realizes that if this is actually Oz, then that means they're in the deadly desert, and anyone who touches the sand turns to sand themselves. They end up having to play the world's scariest game of the floor is lava and follow a trail of rocks out of the sand. But the rocks aren't just any rocks, they actually have faces that Dorothy can't see. These are creatures called gnomes, and they're sent out to spy on the people of Oz. The gnome quickly reports to the Gnome King that Dorothy has returned to Oz, and the only thing that the king can focus on for some reason is the fact that she brought a chicken, and that makes him pissed. After making it to safe land, Dorothy and Belinda go exploring, desperately wanting to reunite with her old friends, specifically the Scarecrow, who is now the king of the Emerald City since the wizard left. But something doesn't feel right. It's eerily quiet, and weirdly, they haven't seen anyone. Dorothy does her best to keep her hopes up, and they come across what looks like a ruined house in the woods. But it's not just any ruined house. It's her old house, the one that took her there in the first place. But why is it in the middle of the woods? Where is Munchkin Land? Very confused, she turns around and finds the now shattered and overgrown yellow brick road. In a panic, she follows the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, which she reaches in a matter of minutes. Something that nearly took a whole movie's length to do the first time. Must have been the musical numbers. When she arrives in the once great Emerald City, she gets the shock of her life. Everything has turned to stone. There's a stone woman reading a book, a stone gardener, and even a circle of stone stone dancing girls with their heads cut off. To add to her horror, she then finds that the Tin Woodsman and Cowardly Lion have also been turned to stone. I'm sorry, but the only thing I can think about is, since when did the Land of Oz get Ozempic? These characters are looking snatched. Unfortunately, there's no sign of the Scarecrow anywhere. The only sign of life is some graffiti on the wall that says, "Beware the Wheelers." It's here we meet the cause of so many children's nightmares.
Come here, chicken!
They are terrifying. Everything from how they move, to how they're shaped, to the way they communicate. I don't blame Dorothy for immediately running for her life as the Wheelers chase after her, laughing and making freaky noises. One of the noises being the same wheel squeaking as we heard in the hospital, which I think is so cool. They corner her against a wall, and just when you think all hope is lost, she discovers a keyhole, which looks like the same size as the Oz key she found back home. Sure enough, it fits, and she quickly escapes into the secret room, which is where she finds TikTok. And no, I don't mean she just starts scrolling through the For You page, although that's probably what I would do in this situation. TikTok is actually a mechanical man who has 3 separate keys on his back that allow him to think, speak, and move. To thank her for bringing him back to life, he promises to be her obedient servant for as long as she keeps him going. With that said, they leave the secret room and TikTok begins fighting off the Wheelers in the most impressive way I have ever seen. Just look at him go. They end up capturing one of the Wheelers, and Dorothy takes the opportunity to demand some answers. He tells them that the Gnome King is the reason that everyone turned to stone, and the only person that knows where the Scarecrow is Princess Mombi. The 3 of them set off to find this Princess Mombi and arrive at this gigantic palace. They enter the beautiful building and find the princess herself. She tells them that she didn't expect company and invites Dorothy to her wardrobe to help her change. Now, you may be thinking 2 things. Number 1, why does she need to change her dress? It's already beautiful. And number 2, why does she need a child to help her change? Well, she actually doesn't mean change her dress. No, that would make sense. What she actually means is changing her head. Literally. Mombi's whole deal is that she keeps hundreds of different heads with varying personalities and beauty, which she switches out depending on her mood. Remember the headless stone women dancing in the Emerald City? Yeah, well, now you know why. The new head she puts on immediately recognizes Dorothy and tells her that the Gnome King kidnapped the Scarecrow and took him back to his palace in the mountains. But just when you thought this character is a nice, helpful lady, it's revealed that the only reason she's being nice is because she wants to trap Dorothy for a few years and then take her head to add to her collection. It just keeps getting worse. Dorothy starts sprinting out of there, but she's no match for Mombi, who catches up to her and drags her through the hall. Where's TikTok in all of this, you ask? Well, his movement key ran out at the worst possible time, so he just has to stand there useless whilst Dorothy gets locked in a tower. This girl just can't catch a break. So she looks around the room trying to find some way to escape when she suddenly hears this faint voice calling out for their mother. It's here we meet our next companion, Jack Pumpkinhead. If you think his design looks familiar, then you'd be correct. When I first saw him, I immediately thought that he looked exactly like Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas. After doing some research, I actually found out that Tim Burton took inspiration from Jack Pumpkinhead's design, which is super interesting. But he could have at least changed the name. I mean, come on. Jack tells Dorothy that he's a sculpture his mum built to scare Mombi, but she didn't get scared. She got angry, and as punishment, she made his creator disappear and used him as a test subject for her newest spell, the Powder of Life. When there was no more need for him, Mombi locked him in the tower and left him to rot. Which is so mean, because Jack is my favorite character. He's just so adorable, and at one point, he asked Dorothy if he can call her mum because he doesn't have a mum anymore, and it's so cute. After Jack mentions the Powder of Life, Dorothy comes up with a plan. Jack sticks his skinny hand through the tower bars to unlock the door, and she tells him to bring TikTok upstairs while she finds the potion in Mombi's room. I'm gonna fast forward a little bit, but Dorothy steals the key from Mombi's headless body and creeps past all the sleeping heads in pursuit of Cabinet 31, which holds Mombi's real head. look familiar? She reaches past the head to grab the powder of life, but of course accidentally wakes up the head, who starts screaming. Cue horror movie moment of Mombi's headless body trying to run down the hall. I don't think I can ever forget it. Upstairs, they start assembling 2 couches with palm leaves for wings and the taxidermied head of a moose-like creature called Gump. Once Dorothy arrives back in the tower, she sprinkles the powder of life all over the creature's body. The Gump's eyes snap open and the gang rushes on board just as Mombi storms into the room. Before she can even realize what she's looking at, the Gump flies out of the window and towards the Gnome King's castle. So at this point of the film, Dorothy now has all the companions she needs to confront the Gnome King, and she's feeling pretty confident. Mombi, on the other hand, is furious and sends off the Wheelers to chase after the group. But not all hope is lost for Mombi, because she still has one prisoner left, Princess Ozma, trapped and forgotten by nearly everyone. The Wheelers catch up to the flying sofa, but the Gump's flight path goes over the deadly desert. One of them chances it for some reason and rolls out onto the sand, only to disintegrate on the spot. I don't know what he thought was gonna happen there. Just as everything seems to be going well, the Gump starts to fall apart mid-air. They try desperately to keep everything together, but eventually everything falls apart and they start plummeting to the ground. For some reason, Dorothy really isn't too fazed at all about falling to her death. Maybe she actually did get the electroshock therapy after all, but thankfully no one was hurt, and Dorothy quickly realizes that they've managed to fall right exactly on the Gnome King's mountain. What are the odds? Before they walk into the Gnome King's lair, they decide to hide Belinda in Jack's head because for some reason everyone in Oz seems to have beef with chickens. When they enter the lair, they become face to face with the king, who emerges from the rock. The group demands that he frees the Scarecrow, and if he doesn't, then they will go and take him by force, because Dorothy and her 3 companions are so intimidating. This causes the Gnome King to burst into a laughing fit so hard that it causes a rock slide. As she's falling down the rabbit hole, she passes thousands of priceless gems, as the king explains that all of Oz's jewels were developed there. The ruler of Oz stole the emeralds to build his city, and all the Gnome King did was take back his stolen property and arrest the ruler who did it. Which, I mean, in that case, is he really the villain? Dorothy argues that that all happened way before the Scarecrow got his brains and became the king. Her slide comes to a stop, and guess who catches her fall? The Scarecrow! Looking extra terrifying with his new look. The Scarecrow suddenly vanishes in a bolt of light. Yep, it was nothing more than a sick and twisted prank by the Gnome King. Of course, he finds this just hilarious, and he taunts Dorothy by telling her that he turned the Scarecrow into an ornament as punishment. At this point, she is just so defeated, and for the first time in the entire movie, she breaks down and cries. This kind of touches the Gnome King, and he actually begins to comfort her. It's at this point you kind of think, oh, maybe he's come around to his senses and he'll let them have the Scarecrow. Nope. Instead, he turns into Jigsaw for some reason and asks the group if they want to play a game. He explains that one by one, they will each go into his room of ornaments and try to find which one is the Scarecrow. When they think they've found it, all they have to do is touch it and say the word Oz. If they guess right, he will be restored and they all get to leave the mountain. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the group surely thought so, because they quickly agreed to play. In all honesty, I think they expected him to look like a Hallmark Scarecrow Christmas ornament or something, but they quickly realize how wrong they were when they go into the room and see this. Yeah, they're in big trouble. So the Gump goes in first, whilst the others just sit and wait in anticipation. While this is going on, the Gnome King is acting like a fantastic host, offering them snacks and having a little tea party. That's until the light flashes and reveals that the Gump has now been turned into an ornament. Dorothy starts freaking out and accusing the king of tricking them, but in all honesty, it's really their fault for not asking what happens if they get it wrong. But now they're stuck playing this impossible game game. Jack is up next, and oh, what a surprise, he also gets it wrong. It's now just Dorothy and the king left in the room alone, and it's a little bit awkward. Also, I'm not sure if many of you have noticed, but the king is now a fully grown clay man dressed in robes. This transformation happens so subtly in the movie that I actually didn't catch it the first time. The king asks Dorothy why she came back to Oz, to which Dorothy replies to see her friends. The king, however, isn't buying it, and he believes that she came back for another reason. I'm sure you're just as confused as Dorothy at this point as to what on earth he could be referring to. There's no way I can do this moment justice, so you're just gonna have to watch it.
Are you sure you didn't come back for these?
It's the way he lifts up his skirt and reveals his little legs. Whose idea was it to have him actually wearing the slippers instead of just holding them? I love it. This scene alone absolutely skyrocketed the budget because if you remember, in the book, the shoes are silver and not ruby. Disney had to pay a hefty fee for the rights to use the ruby slippers from MGM. And their only reasoning was because they would be more recognizable to audiences. Dorothy reaches for her ruby slippers, but the Gnome King declares finders keepers. How very mature. One of the gnomes interrupts the conversation and tells them that TikTok has stopped moving in the middle of his go. Classic TikTok. The king then allows Dorothy to go in and wind her up, considering it's about to be her turn. As Dorothy gets ready to go in, the king stops her and offers her the chance to go home right now using the slippers, on one condition: she will forget about Oz forever. At this point, Dorothy is so over his BS that she just storms past him and doesn't even reply. As she walks into the room, she discovers that TikTok's movement key is completely fine. He was only pretending to be frozen so that he could give Dorothy the best chance at winning. He says if she sees what he transforms into, then maybe she can have a better chance at guessing what the Scarecrow is. It's a pretty genius plan. But in return, he has to sacrifice himself. We then see the saddest moment where they both hug and TikTok sheds a single tear of green oil. He reaches out and touches an ornament. Dorothy holds her breath, waiting to see what happens, but instead of transforming, he disappears completely. The Gnome King was one step ahead and took him away to another part of the cavern. He is just not making this easy. It's now time for her to play the game. She doesn't have a strategy and is just spinning around touching the first thing she sees, which is definitely risky for sure. During all of this, Mombi turns up at the castle and they start arguing about how Dorothy escaped in the first place. She asks him why he's risking the chance letting them play the game in the first place, to which the king explains that the last person who remembers Ozma is gone. He'll become completely human. This doesn't ever actually get explained in the film, so let's just move on. It's now Dorothy's third and final chance. She closes her eyes, spins around, and when she opens them, she sees a huge shiny emerald just sitting on the table. Literally the only emerald colored ornament in the entire room. She gets the feeling that it looks important, and what do you know, she gets it right. The Scarecrow comes back and yippee, they can all go home. Yeah, it doesn't work out like that. You see, the Gnome King is very, very immature, and immature people don't like to lose. Scratch that, they don't lose. They would rather throw a fit and ruin the game for everyone than gracefully admit defeat. And that's exactly what he does. He goes into a rage and starts tearing the place up. The entire mountain is crumbling at this point, and Dorothy has to act quick to save her friends. Of course, she knows now that people from Oz get turned into emerald ornaments, so in a hurry she brings all her friends back to life. But sadly, they're no match for the Gnome King, who has just decided that he's going to eat all of them. I'm not joking. He starts with the Gump, drags his body, and eats him in front of his friends. He reaches for Jack next, and at this point, it's just pure mayhem. The king is dangling Jack into his mouth, and Jack is screaming for his mum. I actually forgot how terrifying this was. Right as he's about to be eaten, Belinda, the chicken, who is still inside of Jack's head, scoots towards the hole and lays an egg which goes straight down the king's throat. Suddenly, the king freezes. He starts choking and his eyes crossed over. And with his last breath, the Gnome King gasps and says that eggs are poison to gnomes. He just straight up dies. Just like that. Death by egg. It's actually crazy. The whole thing about them hating chickens was actually because they were allergic to eggs. Which in that case, I feel like the chicken should have been his first priority when they came into his lair. But never mind, I guess. Dorothy grabs her slippers and they they all head back to the Emerald City where everything is finally restored. They throw a huge party to celebrate, and I also want to mention the amount of costumes in this scene. They're all characters from the books, and I think that detailing is just incredible. They all beg for Dorothy to stay and become the Queen of Oz, to which she declines and says she would rather go back home. Yeah, the home where you were about to undergo electroshock therapy? Are you insane? Belinda, on the other hand, seems to be the only one with common sense and tells Dorothy that she's staying right here in Oz. Then all of a sudden, the blonde girl that we all thought had drowned in the river randomly appears out of nowhere. Turns out her name is Ozma and her father was the King of Oz, which would make her the rightful heir to the throne. When the Gnome King took over, he gave Mombi her head-swapping powers in exchange for trapping Ozma in a mirror. At this point, Dorothy has just had enough and it's time to get out of here. She clicks her heels 3 times and says there's no place like home. She then wakes up in the mud. Yeah, there really is no place like home. She sees that Toto is running towards her, as well as her aunt and uncle who have been non-stop searching for her. They then drop on us that the psych hospital went up in flames and Dr. Worley was killed in the fire. They also arrested Nurse Wilson and we get this creepy shot of her being driven away. Back at the farm, Dorothy is finally happy, which is surprising because I thought she would be a lot more traumatized after everything that she went through, and that, ladies and gentlemen, was Return to Oz. What a wild, wild ride. The film suffered a disastrous theatrical release in 1985, proving to be both a critical and commercial failure, which would haunt Disney for years to come. And despite everything I just said, I actually really do love this movie. It's like Labyrinth, but on crack. Yes, the plot is a bit all over the place, but I think the effects make up for it. CGI just can't do what puppets and animatronics can. It feels real because it is real, and it makes the story so much more impactful. I love the world of Oz, and I think this movie definitely does it justice. But that is all from me today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. You have to let me know your thoughts and opinions on this movie in the comments. Please let me know. If you made it this far, comment the word waffles because I'm actually so curious to see how many people make it all the way to the end. And lastly, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for 15,000 subscribers. My mind is blown, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!